Hello, everybody. This is Joseph P. Farrell with news and views from the Nefarium on Thursday, March 31st, 2016. And as you might guess, the Middle East is in the news once again. I really have to thank people for sending me all of these articles on this particular story. This is a big one, and there's aspects of it that I can't even talk about in this news and views that I'll be blogging about in a couple of days. I've put the links to these articles for you up on YouTube and in the website. There's two articles I'm going to be referring to. The first one is headlined, "Obama and Putin Agree That Turkish Dictator Erdogan Must Go." And this was actually found on the Voltaire Net website. This is an extended commentary and article. I believe this is Webster Tarpley's, one of his websites, and that the article itself is citing Frenchman Thierry Masson that did so much research on 9/11 and the official story and the lack of credibility in it. And the other article is that on Zero Hedge, Pentagon orders hundreds of military families to evacuate Turkey. Now, I want to dive into this by way of approaching the Turkish evacuation first, because then we're going to back into the recent news on the Middle East and President Obama's article that he gave, the interview that he gave that's so very significant in Atlantic magazine that I talked about last week. So here we go. This is Zero Hedge. And here's the important two paragraphs. This was on March 29th. So in other words, just 2 days ago, quote, "Moments ago, the Department of Defense announced that the Secretary of Defense, in coordination with the Secretary of State, has authorized the ordered departure of all Department of Defense dependents not assigned to the Chief of Mission Authority from Adana, including Incirlik Air Base, Izmir, and Mugla, Turkey. The decision allows for the deliberate safe return of family members from these areas due to continued security concerns in the region." It adds that, quote, "While this step does not signify a permanent decision to end accompanied tours at these facilities, the evacuation is intended to mitigate the risk to Department of Defense elements and personnel, including family members, while ensuring the combat effectiveness of U.S. forces and our mission support to operations in Turkey. The United States and Turkey are united in our common fight against ISIL, and Incirlik continues to play a key role in counter-ISIL operations. The decision to move our families and civilians was made in consultation with the government of Turkey, our State Department, and our Secretary of Defense," unquote, said General Philip M. Breedlove, commander of the U.S. European Command. Quote, "We understand this is disruptive to our military families, but we must keep them safe and ensure combat effectiveness of our forces to support our strong ally Turkey in the fight against terrorism," unquote. Now, again, the official story is this was being done in consultation with the government of Turkey because of ostensible threats against the military families, American military families in our military bases in Turkey. But there's a very different take on this over at Voltaire Net with Webster Tarpley. And I want to begin the article by reading three paragraphs. It's a rather lengthy article. I want to begin by reading 3 paragraphs from the end of the article and then going back to the beginning, because Tarpley and Masson set the context here in terms of the interview that President Obama gave Atlantic magazine, in which he, if you recall, clearly indicated his displeasure with the quote-unquote special relationship that the outhouse of Saud has with the United States. So let's begin with this part here. Quote, "Obama's interview to the Atlantic Monthly is remarkable, since it reads like the memoirs of a president who's already left office and thus feels free to frankly speak his mind. His comments about King Salman of Saudi Arabia, Sarkozy, Cameron, and Erdogan are devastating. The message seems to be that these figures are being told to cooperate, or else they will be exposed for their machinations of recent years and thus destabilized. Prince Turki of Saudi Arabia, who sometimes acts as a spokesman for the royal family, and incidentally, Prince Turki is long thought to be the head of Saudi intelligence, has issued a weak defense, see below, claiming that the Saudis do not support terrorism and are loyal allies. Now, anybody who's investigated the Saudi role in terrorism and even in 9/11 will tell you that this is a very, very dangerous group of people. And quite frankly, that statement there is just plain hypocrisy, all right? Obama has been quoted as saying that the Saudi royals are the worst in the world. I have no disagreement with President Obama there. The situation is complicated by the distinct possibility that the Saudis have obtained nuclear weapons from Pakistan. Now, let's go a little bit further. Amid the confusion, a deus ex machina appeared in the form of Russian President Vladimir Putin at the G20 summit in St. Petersburg, which was held the week after the Syria reversal. Obama pulled him aside. Now remember, this is a couple years ago. Pulled him aside, he recalled to me, and told the Russian president that if he forced Assad to get rid of the chemical weapons, that would indeed eliminate the need for U.S. taking a military strike. This was the moment the president believes he finally broke, meaning Obama, with what he calls derisively the Washington playbook. I have come to believe that in Obama's mind, August 30th, 2013, was his liberation day, the day he defied not only the foreign policy establishment and its cruise missile playbook, but also the demands of America's frustrating high-maintenance allies in the Middle East. So in other words, what they're saying is Obama broke with the idea that Saudi Arabia and Turkey and the other Middle Eastern allies of the United States have some sort of special relationship with the U.S. on that day. All right. Now listen to Turkey's response and quote unquote attempted defense of Saudi Arabia. Quote, a top Saudi Arabian intelligence chief said on Monday that President Barack Obama failed to appreciate all that the kingdom has done to stabilize the Middle East, to fight terrorism and support American priorities, hitting back after the president called Middle Eastern governments free riders on U.S. initiatives. You accuse us, this is Saudi Arabia, Prince Turki, you accuse us of fomenting sectarian strife in Syria, Yemen, and Iraq. Turki Al-Faisal, a Saudi prince and former ambassador to the United States and Britain, wrote in an open letter published on Monday in the English-language Arab News, quote, you add insult to injury by telling us to share our world with Iran, a country that you describe as a supporter of terrorism, unquote. Al-Faisal's letter was a response to comments Obama made in a much-discussed interview with the Atlantic magazine in which Obama referred to the Saudis and other allies as free riders who push the United States to act but contribute little themselves. Obama has long been cooler toward the Saudis and other Arab allies than his predecessor, but his willingness to forcefully criticize any of them stunned many in Washington's foreign policy establishment. Now, I want to agree with all of this because I think, and have argued for many years, as you recall, that Saudi Arabia may be now on the menu. In other words, everybody knows, anybody who's studied Saudi support of these radical Islamist terrorist groups knows that this is a nation that has been involved in funding madrasas and so on and so forth. There's no doubt about it. Every bit as equally involved as has been Iran. Turkey has been acting to some extent as not only America's proxy in supporting ISIS and ISIL and so on, but in point of fact, acting as a kind of proxy for Saudi Arabia. All right. Now, what's interesting here with the pullout of American families from Turkey, again, remembering this just began 2 days ago. And there's other news, as I said, that I will be blogging about in the coming week tied to this story. But I do think that this may be a case where messages are now being sent to Saudi Arabia via Turkey, and that Turkey is as well on the menu. And this, folks, constitutes a sea change. Because what it means, quite frankly, is that the whole Middle East is being discussed at very high levels by the great powers, and every signal is everyone is just finally and simply fed up with Islamic terrorism and its state sponsors. And we know who they are, because now it would appear that Turkey is itself on the menu. Listen to this. This is from the beginning of the Voltaire Net article, and it puts the withdrawal of American forces in a very different light. There's no way to put it otherwise, folks, in a contradictory light than the public spin we have been told by Department of Defense spokesman General Breedlove. In his case, everything is fine. America is responding to concerns of the Turkish government and responding to concerns about security for American families at those military bases. But Tarpley's reading and Voltaire Net's reading is completely contradictory. Listen carefully. Quote, especially important is the agreement reached by Presidents Obama and Putin about 2 or 3 weeks ago that the continued tenure of Turkish President Erdogan is intolerable and that he should be removed from office before he can start a wider war. Russian and U.S. weapons are currently flowing into Turkey. Now notice that statement, Russian and American weapons are currently flowing into Turkey for the purpose of speeding the departure of the dictator. Contacts are also being made with the Turkish political parties, top generals of the Turkish military, and others to help bring down the dictator. In other words, what they're talking about is coup d'etat, and if that won't work, what you see both of them doing, according to Tarpley, is putting all of the logistics infrastructure inside of Turkey for civil war and an attempted military overthrow of Tayyip Erdogan, all right? The Turkish nationalists are turning against Erdogan. The PKK will also mobilize. Erdogan's presidency is illegitimate because his most recent election victory was carried out with massive voter election fraud. Fighting inside Turkey on a level of a civil war is expected to begin during April. The beginning of the end for Erdogan will transform the entire Middle East situation. Most of the larger cities in Syria will soon be free of terrorist rebels. This is likely to include Aleppo, Palmyra, and Idlib. Now, please note that this is what they're doing. They're getting ready for an overthrow, for a toppling of the Erdogan government. But I submit to you, my friends, that in the context of Saudi Arabia's support for Erdogan, that it's not only a message being sent to Ankara. The real, pardon me, the real subject of this message, the real direction of this message is Riyadh. And as the articles have been pointing out concerning all of this story, Saudi Arabia is now rumored to have purchased anywhere from 5 to a dozen atomic bombs. And they're nuts enough to use them. But unfortunately, that's a kind of atomic pop gun. These will do the Saudi regime absolutely no good whatsoever. They've just spent a lot of money that they didn't need to. What's really interesting here is they're playing the covert operations card together. And if Tarpley's reading of this situation is true, if Thierry Mason's reading of this situation is true, this is going to be a template for future action in the Middle East. And I don't blame Riyadh and ultimately Tehran for feeling a little bit of the pressure now, because the game is going to be, if you continue to play this destabilization game in the Middle East, it's not going to be with great power sanction. So perhaps, and please underline the word here, perhaps we are beginning to see a change in the so-called special relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia, and the message is being sent via Turkey, which, according to Tarpley and Mason, have now been placed on the menu. Now, as I said, there is some corroborating evidence out there that suggests that some sort of big paradigm shift is underway, but you're going to have to wait for that one. when I blog about it this coming Saturday. That's it for the news and views today on Thursday, March 31st, 2016. God bless everybody, and I'll see you on the flip side.